In this module, we're going to briefly talk about new librarianship and its relationship to advocacy. Not all the concepts of new librarianship, or what we come to know as new librarianship, need to be sort of adhered to, explained, and thought thoroughly to understand how we're going to use expect more to advocate. But it's helpful to have a background, particularly because it exists in sort of a larger world, and these modules are intended for librarians who are going to go out and use it. So we thought it'd be useful to have some background information. New librarianship, and you'll notice the new in quotes. New librarianship began its life actually as something called participatory librarianship, and it was the question of how does social media and social networks and the increased participation in electronic networks of folks influence librarianship. What's going on here? Is this sort of a new type of collection? Is this just a simple new tool to be used in the same thing that we've always done? This white paper, Participatory Networks, the Library's Conversation, really began to lay out concepts of participation and how people could participate in libraries and not simply use or consume them. It really began to talk about changing the dynamics of libraries as collections, materials, and information places to libraries as hub for learning, knowledge, and conversation. This was later developed into a little bit more full thinking in the form of the Atlas of New Librarianship. The Atlas of New Librarianship was a publication that really sort of said, wait, what we're talking about is not a different kind of librarianship. What we're talking about is not a different addition to existing librarianship or a service on top of. It really is a new way of thinking about librarianship. So the reason the new is there in quotes is this book, and much of what I talk about, is that librarianship itself is about knowledge and learning and community and connections. And let me just, before we go too far here, be really clear. When I talk about community, a community can be a place, a town, a city, a county, a state. But a community is really any common variable where people come around that variable and they have to divvy up resources. So a university is a community around education and learning. A K-12 organization, also a community around education and learning. A business, a law firm, hospital, all of these are examples of communities. And so when we talk about librarianship that is based in community learning, that doesn't just mean in public settings or academic settings or school settings, but all settings in which librarianship functions. The emphasis on this form of new librarianship that we're going to talk about was really on the professional. What is a librarian in the midst of all this technological change? Can we have librarians that don't have collections, that don't have buildings, that don't work in things called libraries? And what is it that holds them together? We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So the Atlas of New Librarianship came out in 2011. It was geared towards library scholars and library students, and it got very good reception. But it really needed an additional tool, where this book, which frankly is a rather large tome, was geared towards people in the field. It became very evident that we needed to talk about these ideas with people outside of the field. How could we advocate for librarianship? As we'll talk about in a moment, one of the great barriers is not librarians not wanting to change, but communities that don't want librarians to change their libraries. And so we really needed to talk about how do we build an instrument that begins to change people's minds about what is a library, what is a librarian, and what they can do. And so in 2012, we came out with the Expect More text. And that Expect More text was geared towards non-librarians. It's been used in a lot of library classrooms and in library instruction, but that wasn't its main purpose. As time went on, we needed to sort of bring Expect More up to date, some new stories, some new statistics, some new information, and also capture what was happening out in the field. When people were going to use Expect More, how were they using it? And so a consortium was formed, and the consortium of libraries and library organizations put in funds and such to develop a next version of Expect More, one that these modules are based on, and also to turn this book in and modules into an education sitting, professional development, learning, training, which if you're watching this, you are probably a part of. Just as a quick side note before I go into a little bit more depth, there is a third volume that sort of completes this set called the New Librarianship Field Guide. We're not going to talk much about it in these modules, but I wanted you to be aware of it. The New Librarianship Field Guide is really the textbook version of the Atlas of New Librarianship. Much more linear, much more geared towards getting people up to speed. It also doesn't just talk about librarians as a professional, but it talks about libraries and what are libraries and how do we view them in this view. But for a moment, let's go into librarianship as it was presented in the Atlas of New Librarianship. The core of librarianship as presented in the Atlas really is all around a mission. The mission of librarians, and that is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities, which is a grand sounding mission because I think librarianship is a rather grand and noble profession. But we can also break this down. The mission of librarians is to make things better in our communities. Really, it's to help communities make smarter decisions. Once again, be those communities, localities, be they institutions, what have you. And how are they going to help people make better decisions? By making those communities and the people within it, frankly, smarter, more aware of what's going on, more in touch with facts, more aware in what the community is doing and the assets and resources, and most particularly important, the aspirations of their communities. So facilitating knowledge creation is just a really fancy way of saying helping them learn or learning. So the mission of librarians is to make things better by helping their communities learn and help them make those better decisions. The core of really what this text does by breaking down what do I mean by librarians, improve societies, facilitating knowledge creation communities can be summed up this way. When we look at what is a librarian in the age of networks and social media, when we look at digital libraries and virtual libraries, when we look at people with library science degrees who are working in institutions that are not libraries, and when we look at people without those library science degrees running libraries, what is it that holds us together? Is it that degree? Is it just the title? Is it where we work? A lot of what led to the Atlas was a simple or seemingly simple question, which was, how do you define a librarian outside of the context of a library? How do you define a librarian without referencing the building and books and materials? What is it that makes someone a librarian? And the short answer, just to give away the twist ending here, is that it's a combination of the mission of that individual to improve society, to help people make smarter, the values they bring to it, the notion of intellectual honesty, the notion of access and equity, the notion of service and learning, and then the means by which they go about doing this. So the idea that it's not just a matter of access, for example. People can have access to information, books, materials, databases, online information, and still not be able to make better decisions, not be more informed, not be more able to go out and have a positive impact in their community. So it's access, but it's also knowledge, basic knowledge, instruction, training, be it digital literacy, information literacy, be it about how to engage and have conversations. It's also about the environment that we provide. That is, do we do this in an environment where people are able to openly seek information? I've often said, and I'll say again, that a library should be a safe place to explore dangerous ideas. So that's about the environment. And finally, the motivation. Why are people going to do this? Is it altruism? Is it philanthropy? Is it in economic self-interest? What is it that they're seeking to do? By understanding the means by which we help people develop knowledge, learn, by doing it around a set of principles and values long-standing within our profession, and by doing it, once again, with the goal of making communities smarter. That's what makes a librarian. It's not because we have a building that says library on it. It's not because we collect things. It's not because we organize things. It's because we bring all of those together in a principled way for community service and community impact. So this could easily be summed up actually as the community is your collection. That is, that those books, the materials, the buildings, online databases, websites, technologies, Kindles, bookmobiles, all of these are tools to help develop your true collection, and those are the people within your community. Our communities, be they academic or physical or school or what have you, are populated with genius. They're populated with plumbers and engineers and authors and seamstresses and the whole gambit of information. People with a deep understanding and history of where they are, people with a vision of where they're going. And so that's our true collection. When we focus on knowledge, not as a recorded thing, not as something that sits in the book, but really knowledge as in what people know and how that changes their behavior and their actions, then we need to shift and stop looking at the things that we collect and buy and license as the collection, but to look at those as a tool to help our true collection, which are the people out in that community. So that's sort of the quick, easy summary version of the atlas. You're welcome. You don't have to read the 800 pages, 400 pages. What is it about Expect More? How do we take that and then communicate that out to our communities, to our provosts, our principals, our boards? How do we communicate that to the senior partner who's in charge of overseeing the library functions, things of that nature? That's where Expect More comes in. So Expect More can be summed up around the concept that bad libraries build collections, good libraries build services, of which a collection is only one of the services we offer, but great libraries build communities. That the reason we're there, the reason we are in a building or on a research team or on a legal team or doing some embedded work, the reason we do that is to help communities develop and aspire to new things. So we do that through, sometimes, collections, collecting books, collecting materials, licensing databases, true. But that's not enough to simply gather materials together as hoarding. So we add organization, which is a service. The idea of cataloging and shelving and all those things are services. Reference is a service, providing online instruction, providing on-campus instruction, providing one-to-one consultation, reference services. These are all services. Digitization is a service. And those are really important. That if we begin to think not simply about the stuff we have, but how that impacts other people's use of that stuff and what they're trying to accomplish, that's good. But great libraries go beyond the individual and the use and user, the consumer and customer, to the true notion that libraries and librarians are part of communities. And their goal is to make communities better, smarter, faster, better able to deploy their resources, more inclusive, more diverse, more agile. And those aspirations are going to change from community to community. And so a great library isn't the same in one community as another, in one city as another. Sometimes not even in the same branches within a public library or within the same school library within the same school district. They barely are based on what it is, our collection, our community, our members that we're trying to accomplish. This can be summed up actually borrowing a concept from John Palfrey's work on bibliotech, where he talks about the dangers of nostalgia. And this is really where Expect More comes and where we're going to spend time on advocacy. And that is the dangers of nostalgia. Now, sometimes this nostalgia comes from librarians, the good old days. There's a common joke, for example, of why do public libraries have friends groups so that retired librarians can take all the weeded materials and bring them back in the building. But oftentimes what we deal with is the fact that school board members making decisions about school libraries may not have been in a school library for 20 years. Or people making decisions on public library boards think about the library of their childhood and not what it could be. So what we're going to talk about here and what this Expect More is all about is that, yes, there are libraries and librarians who sort of are wedded to an old narrative. The concept of the library as place, the library as collection, physical books, and the importance of physical books. Yes, that's true. But that's actually less of a problem, I would argue, than communities wedded to this old narrative. Many of our communities, once again, our academies, our schools, our villages, our towns, our states, our employers, our employees, are wedded to an old idea of libraries. And what we need to do as librarians and advocates is we need to get them to, here it comes, expect more. To believe that, yes, that's wonderful that you loved this as a library. We can't believe how that's evolved today, and you're going to love it even more. And we have to be careful on how we advocate. For example, if you say we're books plus, what you're constantly doing is emphasizing that you're still books. And that all the other things we do, from access to the internet to literacy and instruction to metadata and digitization, to all these things are simply extras on top. We need to actually show them that the books part was a service that was built up and has a history, and where that comes from and why we keep evolving, and the idea that databases and online systems and technologies are just as important tools today as before. Because many of the communities that we work with lack the justifications, the narrative. How does this hold together? I understood in my idea that a library was a place with books. Now you have maker spaces and 3D printers and you have sewing machines. Why is this here? We need to give them the narrative that says, this is how these things proceeded and it makes sense and you're part of this and it's better for your community. And then we need to give lots of examples. Because a lot of times we're dealing, once again, with examples that come from the past, examples that are only that's right around us. And what Expect More sought to do is say, hey, look at what's happening here, and look at what's happening here, and look at what's happening here. And so what we're going to carry on and do with these modules as we progress forward is we're going to take a look at the text of the book. And the text of the book is there to read. And this is the material that we can then take out and talk to our communities with. But the utility of these modules of this course is to go beyond just the idea of here's a text, read it, but to really take things like me and break it down and say, hey, now here's what I was doing in this section. I've had success in using this, where we link this idea to a larger inspirational event or a larger narrative. So the modules aren't so much about the text. That's there. But ripping the text apart and talking about how it's useful, what's the underlying concept, here are additional examples, here's a way of talking about it. Let's take this example and here's how you can use it in a conversation. So the goal is to use the text as a base that our communities will read, and to use these modules as a base that we can learn how to work with those communities to come up with more. So I look forward to this. I welcome your comments, your inputs, and your thoughts. And let's get started.